Criticizing is a very easy thing to do, but a very difficult thing to do effectively. It's a very common mistake to think that all you need to do is be correct about what needs to change, and as long as you are, you've succeeded. The scary thing is that being correct about what has to change is comparatively the easy part. Sure, sometimes you get someone who's already willing to listen to you. People don't, for example, pay me to VOD review them on Medify if they don't intend to hear me out. One of the beautiful things about being a YouTuber is that your audience self-selects for you. What's harder is being a classroom teacher. Those kids aren't all there because they want you to teach them. I had a student once who turned in no homework, did no assignments, and didn't listen in class. The only points they scored all year were on tests, all of which they failed. They knew that they'd graduate to the next year anyway because of the school's policy, so there wasn't enough leverage for their parents, their teachers, anyone in the community to both lead them to water and make them drink. My grandpa bought me a copy of an old book called How to Win Friends and Influence People. And one of the things I've been thinking about a lot from going through it has been a theory about convincing people. To paraphrase, the only way to convince someone to do something is for them to want to do it themselves. Sure, you can blackmail and threaten someone into something, but in the end, they're making the decision because they want to avoid the harm you're threatening, because you've changed the situation they're reacting to, not because you've changed them. Convincing someone is the fundamental problem at the root of all politics, by definition. If people disagree about what should be done, what gets done? Well, sometimes the people who have power need to be convinced to change their positions. Generally, people have gotten more and more polarized in their politics lately, meaning there has been increasing failure at convincing people to change their positions. This is something that always turns over in my head when there arises a call in the community for change, something that's happened on Blue Sky recently regarding the treatment of women in the scene. It strikes me as a tremendously difficult and frustrating challenge for the people speaking up to convince people in the scene about. People are rightly taught to grow up with a certain amount of self-esteem, told they're special, told they're loved. Just being able to tell yourself in your own mind that you are a good person and believe it is a frighteningly powerful psychological motivator. I've seen people do mental gymnastics totally divorced from reality because they desperately needed to be able to arrive at the conclusion in their heads that they aren't a bad person. So to be told that literally everyone who has contact with any amount of modern society is inherently misogynistic to some degree, that it's baked into basically all of us, that all of us are a little bit messed up in that way, that's a really hard thing to convince someone of. They fuck you up, your mom and dad. They may not mean to, but they do. They fill you with the faults they had and add some extra, just for you. But they were fucked up in their turn by fools in old-style hats and coats, who half the time were soppy stern and half at one another's throats. There are a lot of very strong reasons to not want to believe that. One of the most convincing conversations I've ever had was with a wonderful woman who had lived long enough that she remembered the invention of the polio vaccine. I've never been a skeptic of vaccines. Still haven't caught diphtheria or the measles or hepatitis, and I don't know anyone else who has either. But even so, the way this one conversation affirmed my conviction in that is something I've only experienced so many times before in my life. To start with, she spoke very gently and very conversationally, and we had established a good rapport up until that point. How can you not like the nice lady who feeds the birds out on the front step and invites you to sit down and talk with her? Every single time I already had another commitment, it hurt to tell her I wasn't able to sit with her that day. That's an important part of it. Remember, people are only convinced by what they want. One of the things I wanted was to be friends with that person. I liked the way she was kind to me, and I wanted for that to continue. In a classroom setting, it was easier to have a positive influence on the students who wanted me to approve of them, for much the same reason. If our relationship hadn't been so positive, and she had come out the gate taking swings at me, "Why don't you have a girlfriend yet? Your hair is too long. Your generation is so entitled." Well, if she isn't going to like me anyway, what motivation do I have to be convinced by her? It feels like she's never going to have positive regard for me, so there's nothing to work for. She's lost all her leverage by not establishing the possibility that we could get along. This woman had lived in the same place for longer than I've even been alive. She could point to major highways built in the 60s and talk about what the area looked like before they were built. Another part of my motivation to listen was that she had knowledge and experience of the place that I was in, the place I was living, that was molding me and being molded by me. I wanted to learn about the place because it affected me. When she started talking about vaccines, she brought up something that had affected her that had never affected me: polio. For me, polio has only ever existed in history books. I knew that Franklin Delano Roosevelt had it from pictures in my US history textbooks, but this was the first person I'd met as a friend who had spoken about it. She knew people who had suffered from polio, had needed to use an iron lung to breathe, some of them for the rest of their lives. But she also saw that as soon as the vaccine went out, there was suddenly no new suffering from it. The fact that it was told as a story was also very convincing. There's something about us that's adapted to processing information in the form of stories better than statistics or proofs. We certainly owe it to ourselves to become as receptive as possible to those more precise instruments of reasoning and information conveyance, but also, if someone is already receptive to statistics and scientific reasoning, they're not going to stay skeptical of vaccines for very long. For those who are, it might take a story, a personal experience of yours or of someone who shared it with you. Part of the problem with our current crisis of media literacy is that learning media literacy isn't just a matter of intelligence. It's not about the ability to reach the right answer. It takes emotional regulation. People become bad faith actors when they can't handle good faith criticism. A kid gets told to stop bullying another kid, and instead of being humble enough to deem someone else's ideas worth considering, instead of being secure enough to self-reflect, to deem their actions wrong, and to work to be a better version of themselves, to repair their relationship to that person, to assume that that person can still have positive regard for them if they work for it, they change nothing. They resolve the cognitive dissonance by deciding that everything would be fine if they just weren't being criticized, if that critic just didn't have power over them. Most of us are guilty of this at some point, especially when we were less mature, but for some people, this impulse calcifies and becomes their whole personality. They take it to its logical extreme, ending up with the mindset that might makes right, that even if you can just trick someone into giving it to you, it's yours. That moral principles are just children's fairy tales with no practical basis, no cause and effect relationships that actually affect a person. They celebrate trolling and layers of irony because it helps them hide their true motives from their targets, their allies, and even from themselves. For them, it's even more emotionally valuable to destroy the good faith actor's ability to tell them what to do than it is to live a happy life. That spite is what we're fighting culturally right now. Not stupidity, not leaders of cults of personality, just that core personal failing. To an extent, we can lead people to water, but can't make them drink. They have to realize on some level, at some point, that continuing to follow certain courses of action are harming themselves and harming other people. But as time has gone on, what I've been forced to learn as a teacher is how to soften my approach. Not to come out the gate swinging at someone, but to try and build a rapport first, to tell stories. And that the more careful I am to do those things, the more successful I am at being a positive influence. Something I really appreciate about this community is that when a serious issue like misogyny comes up, what most of the voices in the community will tell you is to listen to the experiences that other people are sharing. Just to listen, open-mindedly, not to respond, listen. These are stories they're telling, they're personal experiences. The stories are coming from people we know. people we've played games with, people we're friends with, people we're motivated to get along with, not just all random internet strangers whose approval we may believe is out of reach for us. And a lot of them are shared with a patience I admire deeply, and can't be sure I would be exhibiting if I were in their shoes. Some people are less patient. Some people are fed up with how they've been treated and have very negative feelings. Sometimes it's important to square with the intensity of those feelings to really understand the scope of the problem. Some people are afraid and angry because they've been told by their society that their bodies are made for someone else's benefit. And they see tiny hints of that horrific ideology, that horror movie concept, literally everywhere they go, even in places as silly and mundane as their Splatoon team's voice call. Some of the people are genuinely trying to rid their own minds of that specific ideology, but fail to realize some ways that the very thing they hate is still leaking through the cracks. It can feel inescapable, and that's something it's hard to stay civil about. I hope we can recognize that. I'm not a woman, in case anyone wasn't sure. So it's not my voice to draw attention to during conversations like this. I just want to point out, firstly, that there are a lot of women speaking out. That they will not all say exactly the same thing, because they're people, and people don't work like that. But that I think you should want to listen. You should want to listen because they're your friends, your teammates, they're people in this community who run events and form teams and coach people and make content. They're people that bring value to your experience of this game. You should want to listen because they're telling stories you can learn from about their experiences. Experiences that are probably different from yours and that can inform you more about the world around you and the effect you can have on it, in and out of Splatoon. And listen to them because they're making an effort to soften their approach, because they're trying to make this as easy to swallow as possible. They wouldn't do that if they didn't want to be your friends, if they didn't want to support you and buy into you. It's hard to find a better kind of person to criticize us than that. I hope that all of us, myself included, take the opportunity to listen instead of alienating ourselves from the critics to protect our egos.